Thank you everyone for joining us this morning, and we hope this is a educational and helpful tool that can be used in your advocacy. The authors of this report are Juvenile Law Center, Education Law Center, Southern Poverty Law Center, and Drexel University's Juvenile Justice Research and Reform Lab, who helped us do the survey that we're presenting the results of today and in our report. And joining me, my name is Nadia Mozaffar. I'm a senior attorney at Juvenile Law Center, and joining me is my colleague, Kate Burdick, also from Juvenile Law Center, Katherine Dunn from Southern Poverty Law Center, and Maura McInerney will be joining for Education Law Center. And so now I will pass it on to Kate, who will share a little bit about the data that we used.
Yeah, so welcome everyone. I'm Kate Burdick from Juvenile Law Center, and we unfortunately had been hearing for years that this was a huge problem for young people. And we really wanted to drill down and figure out what is really driving this problem, how pervasive is this problem, what are the effects of this problem, so that we could target solutions accordingly. And so to do that, we looked at a number of sources of data. We did a literature review of reports from the past 20 years or so and found this was coming up decades ago as a problem. We had, through the Juvenile Justice Research and Reform Lab at Drexel, they put together a survey to professionals working with young people in the juvenile justice system, and over 200 people filled that out. So you'll see a lot of data, both in this presentation and in the report, that comes directly from that survey, as both quantitative numbers, as well as we received a lot of rich commentary in the open-ended questions of the survey that helped explain the nature of the problem. We did direct interviews with a number of advocates. We have data from the NDTAC that oversees Title I Part D facilities. It's a huge data set, and they publish their data online, but we asked them to pull out specifically the data that pertain to youth in juvenile detention facilities and youth in juvenile correctional facilities, so we could drill down even farther than what was publicly available. And of course, we spoke with young people. Juvenile Law Center has 2 youth advocacy programs, Juveniles for Justice and Youth Fostering Change. And we did both focus groups with them, and they actually had educational reentry as the focus of their substantive projects a few years ago, and produced a report called Operation Education that was something we analyzed closely and worked with them on, and have incorporated their recommendations and comments throughout our credit overdue report. So that's everything we looked at to try to get to the source of the problem here. And I really want to highlight, before we even get into some of the statistics, just how devastating this problem is for young people. You'll see here quotations from 2 of our youth advocates in Juveniles for Justice about how this challenge was particularly devastating for them. Some of the advocates we spoke to described it as being maddening, and one of the survey respondents noted that it was adding to the trauma that young people were already experiencing in the juvenile justice system, because it was making them feel silenced. And, it was one more way that they were being told, this is what you need to do. And then they were doing what they were asked, and yet weren't given credit for that, weren't able to proceed towards graduation as they thought they were. So want to just kind of make sure that everyone understands, really, this is a very, this problem isn't just a paperwork issue, that it really impacts lives. So in our survey, some stark numbers that we found were that only 17% of our respondents said youth always earn credit for all the work they do completed in facilities. In an ideal world, someone is going to earn credit for all the work they do. And our survey respondents made clear that is not happening at all. 17% only said it's all the time that they earn credit for all their work. And it's even lower in detention facilities. Only 9% said youth are receiving credit for all the work they do in detention. And what's more is that of that population that said youth aren't receiving credit for all their work, a large number are saying that it's far fewer credits that they're earning. It's not just like, well, it's half a credit less than they should have gotten. It's actually far fewer credits. And so that's something that we're very concerned about, obviously. When we looked at the NDTAC data, similarly, we found that they reported 1/3 of youth not earning any high school credits while they were in placement facilities, and 2/3 of youth not earning any credit while they were in detention facilities. And we do need to put those numbers in context a little bit. You know, the set of young people who are in detention would include someone who was there for a very short period of time, maybe a day. And so we wouldn't expect that number to be 100 necessarily, because it would be hard to earn a credit in one day, but the large number is still very troubling of youth not earning any credits at all. And that fewer than 2% of youth obtained their high school diploma while they were in detention, and fewer than 7% obtained their diploma while they were in placement. One of the most important things we looked at in the report also was, what is the effect of this? Is this just another thing that happens, or is this really going to knock a young person off the path towards graduation? Unfortunately, we found the latter. Young people were missing school days, having to retake courses, repeat grades. You can see the chart, and in the report itself, we'll drill down on the specific numbers for you. But this really is a problem that is having major impact on a young person's life, being unable to begin or complete their career and technical education, being assigned to alternative disciplinary schools. We see as something when young people come back and they don't have all the credits that they should, or deciding to pursue a GED track instead of a traditional high school diploma. Youth with disabilities being told to graduate on an IEP goal as opposed to with a traditional diploma. And finally, a large number of respondents said that this leads to young people dropping out entirely. And so the other thing we want to note is that credit transfer issues really exacerbate the existing inequities in the education system. So we found that certain groups of young people, Black, Latinx, and Native youth, youth with disabilities, girls, LGBTQ+ youth, non-citizen youth, youth with non-citizen parents, English learners, youth who have experience also in the child welfare system or the adult justice system, or older youth, were all particularly disadvantaged by credit transfer policies and by not receiving their credits. And this is due in part to some of those youth being overrepresented in the system, but it also has to do with the unique interactions that they have, and that the ways in which the discrimination that they experience in the system furthers the effects of credit transfer problems for them.
Thank you, Kate. So after this overview, a little bit that is, really further fleshed out in our report about what the credit transfer crisis really entails, our report then kind of thinks about what causes this problem. And when we think about academic credit transfer, it may seem like somewhat of a narrow paperwork kind of issue, but as we examined the causes of why young people don't receive credit for work that they completed inside facilities, we realized that the causes all had to do with large systemic structural problems with the juvenile justice and education systems. And the first of these is instability, and the instability that young people face when they are in the juvenile justice system, and they are often being moved from placement to placement, from placement to detention center to another group facility. And when they are not in one place for very long, it hinders them in numerous ways. They may not be in the facility long enough to really take a course. They may miss final exams, and 39% of our respondents noted that not being at a facility long enough was the most common reason youth didn't receive credit, while 59% noted that it was one of the reasons. 27% of respondents noted that this was youth not being there for the final exam was one reason that they didn't receive credit. So in addition to these pieces, there's also a huge problem with record transfer, as we'll address shortly. And so records can get lost as young people move from facility to facility. There might be a delay in transfer, or because often these various placements and schools use different types of systems, records don't get translated correctly from facility to facility. And Claire Blumenson, who is the co-founder and executive director of the School Justice Project in Washington, D.C., who was one of the advocates that we interviewed, really sums it up nicely with her quote when she explains that you could have a young person who's at one place for 1 month, one place for another month, one place for another month. And because they don't receive term reports with their short stays, it looks like they've gotten 0 credit, even though they've been moving around placements and doing the work this whole time. And so this idea of instability of that the young people experience is reflected both through our surveys as well as other information that we received from other interviews. And it's just helpful to remember that this also is compounded by the fact that even before young people enter the juvenile justice system, in their schools, they often face a lot of instability where they may move from school to school, they may face exclusionary discipline, and we know that that's often done in a very racially discriminatory way. And so they might already be somewhat behind in their academics because of this instability. And then this is further exacerbated by the instability that they face in the juvenile justice system. Second, we also learned about the poor quality of education that is often available at juvenile justice facilities. And so whenever we talk to our youth advocates about the type of education that they receive, they often describe a setting where there's no instruction or qualified teachers in the classroom. They're just given worksheets or other busy work that they complete on their own, while a classroom will have all sorts of young people of different ages and grade levels. Teachers don't always have required qualifications, and then the coursework required for graduation is not provided. So the type of work that the young person is doing inside the facilities just simply isn't of the quality that would encourage a school to give them credit after they leave. And this was also again reflected in our survey responses. When asked why youth did not receive credit, 33% said lack of classes fulfilling core requirements, 25% noted that courses were not sufficiently rigorous, and then additionally, 27% noted that courses are not aligned with school or district standards. And this problem really highlights a lot of the frustration that Kate mentioned that young people face, because when they're going into one of these schools where the quality of education is not appropriate or the courses don't meet the right core requirement standards, a young person can put in all the effort, do all of the work that's asked for them, think that they're making progress, but nothing they can do can really change the result that they're not going to get academic credit simply because the coursework and academics that are provided are not up to certain quality standards. And finally, we wanted to talk about the inadequate infrastructure that leads to the credit crisis and problems associated with that. And so first, there's often a lack of coordination between the web of agencies that may be responsible for youth in juvenile justice facilities. So different states, localities may do this differently, where sometimes a school district has responsibility for a young person's education. Sometimes the school district where the person comes from has responsibility for the education, or the juvenile justice facility has responsibility for the education. And there's so many players, and it's not always clear who is responsible for the young person, and the fact that there needs to be strong coordination, because as young people move from the facility to their school, and maybe this happens several times, there needs to constantly be coordination and communication between these agencies. And we find that this doesn't happen, and young people, unfortunately, are the ones that fall through the cracks. Additionally, as I mentioned, there could be lost, delayed, incomplete, or incorrect records. And even if they're all correct and there and complete, there's also this issue of, this very simple but impactful issue that a different school district might call a credit a different, call a course a different word or a different name. And so it requires some interpretation to figure out what classes did a young person really take, what did they learn, and how does that correspond to the coursework that's required for graduation at the person's school. And if there isn't someone there, like a staff member, to really assist students with that credit transfer and to help them understand what courses they actually took, that young person isn't going to be able to receive their credits. So we're going to move on now to the solution section of this, but it's really important for us to understand that structural problems really cause these issues, so we can think of the structural solutions that are needed. Because, for example, we are never going to say that a young person should stay in a facility longer in order to get their credits. We're never going to say that we should spend all of our time really just focusing on making sure we have A+ programs inside education facilities. While that's important, we also know that there's a lot of trauma and other consequences of young people being locked up. And so we have to take a more systemic approach to this problem, and that's what we'll discuss in the following slides.
Thanks so much, Nadia, and to all my co-panelists for all their work on this issue. That's exactly right. I mean, educating youth in their community schools ensures, that students not only receive continued and quality education, but that especially during these times, during this pandemic, they stay safe and healthy and get the supports that they need to thrive. And the best way to ensure that youth remain in their community schools and don't face the credit transfer issues that we covered in our report is through decarceration. So while this webinar focuses on the many struggles that students face to get credit for their work in the juvenile justice system and how to address this pervasive issue, we wanted to be sure to highlight some ways that states and communities can advance decarceration of children and youth to get at the systemic solutions that Nadia mentioned. So decarceration work can happen at multiple points along the school to prison pipeline. Some examples of ways that states and communities are working to decarcerate by impacting different areas of the pipeline include, on the school end, limiting the use of exclusionary discipline, which increases the likelihood that a young person will be funneled into the juvenile justice system, and instead investing in restorative justice and supports for students. At least 16 states and DC have policies limiting or prohibiting suspension and expulsion for young children. And at least 15 states also limit the use of school pushout in response to truancy. Our team at the SPLC Action Fund worked on legislation, Senate Bill 189 last session, that would establish statutory due process protections for students facing exclusionary discipline and limiting the use of exclusionary discipline. Passed through the Senate, we expect it to be reintroduced in 2021. Similarly, the Louisiana legislature just passed a bill setting particular due process protections for students who are expelled during this period of virtual learning. So those are some examples of states that are moving forward on this way of keeping youth in their community schools. And a lot of states are also moving to hold accountable the ways that schools incorporate police officers. And so in Louisiana in 2019, a bill was passed that required annual disaggregated reporting on student referrals to law enforcement and on arrests. So increasing oversight where there is police presence, but more and more we're seeing communities actually move away from police presence in schools, knowing that the very presence of police officers increases the chance that a student will be arrested and end up in the juvenile justice system. Minneapolis, Oakland, Seattle are some examples where jurisdictions have moved to remove police from schools, but there are many more jurisdictions where students and communities are working to achieve police-free schools currently. Another example is, the juvenile justice system combines large numbers of children and youth for low-level offenses, including technical violations and status offenses. So states can move to prohibit incarceration for status offenses. And there's federal legislation that also mandates deinstitutionalization of status offenders. A number of states have also ended commitment to secure juvenile facilities for low-level or nonviolent offenses. States can also invest in pre-arrest diversion programs, which offer youth accused of misdemeanors, community-based options, alternatives such as counseling or substance or mental health counseling, and restorative measures like community impact statements and restitutions as options. In Florida, which is one of the states where we work at SPLC, nearly 10,000 or over 60% of eligible youth in Florida avoided formal prosecution through pre-arrest diversion in the last year. States can also set or increase the minimum age of prosecution in juvenile court. Most states do not do this, and of course can reinvest resources into community-based alternatives. And in Georgia, a grant program was created in 2013 for counties that reduce the number of committed youth, and that program has shifted tens of millions of dollars to these community-based alternatives and closed several juvenile justice facilities. I'll pass it to Maura to get into some of the solutions specific to the credit transfer issue problem.
Great, thanks so much, Katherine. So I wanted to focus attention on the importance of having state legislation to provide a uniform response to these problems and establish requirements that would apply to students across each state. This is imperative in part because of the practical reason that children are highly mobile. They're going from maybe one placement to another, one local education agency to another. But there's another important reason to do this, which it has to do with the fact that there are federal mandates for state education agencies and local education agencies to ensure that students who are in the juvenile justice system are able to access and receive credit for the credits that they have earned. And I wanted to focus in part on the Every Student Succeeds Act and what those provisions mean. So as all of you may know, the Every Student Succeeds Act, broad federal education law, actually replaced the No Child Left Behind Act. And in part of ESSA, it has to do with Title I, Part D, which provides federal funding to state and local agencies who serve youth who are neglected, delinquent, or at risk. So those funds are provided by the federal government and with certain assurances, and those assurances are actually laid out in ESSA. And in part, there were more rigorous standards put into place under ESSA, which was adopted in 2016. So to receive that funding, state educational agencies have to provide assurances to the federal government that their plans include, quote, procedures to ensure timely re-enrollment of each student who has been placed in the juvenile justice system in secondary school or in a re-entry program that best meets the needs of the student, including the transfer of credits that such students earn during placement. And just to drill down on that a little, this includes at the front end, ensuring that children have the academic records that they need and that those are provided to the placement, and also that there is a rigorous assessment that is done that actually meets state standards, so that we're not talking about doing an educational assessment that doesn't align with what the child needs to learn. And on re-entry planning, those provisions are much more rigorous. They talk about timely and appropriate re-enrollment of students, the importance of collaboration between local education agencies and the placement to ensure that you facilitated the transfer of records, but also that students have access to a traditional high school diploma and that they have expanded access to post-secondary opportunities and workforce success. So all of those are in the various provisions of ESSA, and those are critically important and actually were the impetus for some states to adopt new state legislation. We can go to the next slide. Also, I wanted to emphasize the Juvenile Justice Delinquency and Prevention Act. And in that case, federal funding is received in state plans. It must include the assurance that the agency that are overseeing the juvenile has collaborated with the state education agency and developed and implement a plan to ensure the timely transfer of student records, academic records are assessed and transferred, and that the youth adjudicated delinquent receives full or partial academic credit for work done in custody. Now, these provisions were adopted after ESSA, and they really mirror a lot of the protections that we see in the Every Student Succeeds Act. So these two kind of go hand in hand to ensure that state education agencies have undertaken efforts to ensure that local education agencies and juvenile justice placements are coordinating, are collaborating to ensure that credits are that a student is receiving credits, and that in a sense, those credits also will count towards graduation, because that is the goal of both acts, to ensure that there is increased graduation rates for the student population and to ensure that they have access to expanded educational opportunities. So we focus in our report on recommendations for legislation at the state level. And the reason that we do this is because the state needs to be responsible for creating that uniform infrastructure and structural supports to ensure that credits are transferred, regardless of the particular placement where a child lands. So this is critically important because you have to build the infrastructure for accountability at the state level to ensure that you're monitoring this, that data is being collected, and that you are uniformly defining how credits are assessed, are recognized, and are transferred. So you need interdisciplinary teams for that rigorous reentry planning, and that's what we're seeing uniformly and consistently in some of the legislation that has been adopted and that has been effective and that is highlighted in the report. You need on the ground level to have transition coordinators, so someone at the local education agency that's responsible for ensuring that credits are transferred, but also someone at the state level who is recognizing that this is occurring and effectively happening across the board. And you need to require schools to maintain and promptly transfer accurate and complete records. This is critically important. You'll see that you've got to think exit at entry. So when the child is entering that juvenile justice placement, that you are taking all of this into account. And that is essentially what ESSA mandates, that at the entry point, that you are ensuring that the records have transferred and that you are providing an adequate education for that child that aligns with state standards, that aligns with what is the goal in the local education agency, so that that facilitates the transition for that child upon re-entry to their local education agency. So all of that is critically important, and the infrastructure must exist at both the state level to ensure accountability, and that local education agencies are clear on their responsibilities and duties, and also that juvenile justice placements are doing their part and ensuring that they are providing an adequate education for children to earn credits that will count towards graduation, so that these children won't be left behind by the system that supposedly is seeking to ensure their success in life.
Great, thank you, Maura. And just as a note that when you look at our report in the appendix, we include statutes from around the country, and they're annotated to kind of highlight which of them corresponds with the recommendations that we offer. So if you want specific examples of how, a transition coordinator can be mandated by statute, or how what interdisciplinary teams look like or who they consist of, there's plenty of examples in the report that'll really show how states at least have legislated this issue. And as we talk about a little bit later, another big piece, of course, is implementation and carrying out what's in the legislation. So in addition to the infrastructure piece, there's 3 other pieces of legislation that we recommend, or 3 other sections of legislation that we recommend. So I will quickly go through them, but then once again, please know that there is much more detailed information about each of these in our report. but we tried to frame the recommendations to address each of the major problems that we discussed earlier in the report: the instability, the poor quality of education, and the lack of infrastructure. And so a couple of our recommendations really go to this idea that youth must receive credit-bearing, more high quality education inside juvenile justice facilities. And two of the ways that we recommend this can happen is, first, require continuous enrollment of youth in the school district of residence. So this is especially for young people who are going into detention facilities and may only be there for, a couple of days, a week, not very long, really no longer than a young person may miss school for a variety of other things. And what happens sometimes is that even if they're just there for a very short amount of time, they're unenrolled from their school district of residence and then re-enrolled or attempted to re-enroll in whatever school district is functioning within the placement or the detention facility. And one way to resolve the back and forth credit record transfer problem is just allow them to continually be enrolled in their school district of residence, so there's smoother transitions as they go back and forth. And second, requiring prompt access to credit-bearing courses that count towards graduation, legislating that those types of courses are available inside juvenile justice facilities. We also encourage both juvenile justice facilities and school districts to enact policies that encourage graduation. And so the four ways: first, credits and partial credits transfer and count towards graduation. And so not only legislating that credits transfer when a young person goes from facility to facility, which is something, as Maura mentioned, is part of JJDPA and ESSA, we specifically really want to focus on this issue of partial credits because, as we've mentioned, a lot of times young people are not in a facility for very long or moving from facility to facility. And if they can even, they're getting credit is sometimes dependent on, did you get sent to a juvenile justice facility in January, where maybe then you can complete a semester, or April, where you've missed half the semester. And just, basing it on something that's totally outside of the young person's control is really unfair. So allowing for a system that gives them credit for partial credits will allow them to continue to earn credits, even if, the timing of when they entered the facility or when they left the facility is a little, doesn't fall neatly within a semester or quarter schedule. That youth are enrolled in appropriate courses or appropriate schools with access to credit-bearing courses. This is really highlighting the idea that a young person shouldn't be sent to an alternative school just because they leave a juvenile justice facility, that their specific needs and should be considered, and they should be put in an appropriate school where they have access to credit-bearing courses. Third, that there's options to waive and make up credit, as well as various pathways to diploma. And in our report, we really dig into the various creative and various ways that a young person can receive credit, and the work that a school can do to kind of really figure out, here is what a young person's transcript says, here is how this reflects what they've learned. And I see that they've, for example, taken Algebra 2, so I can waive their Algebra 1 requirement because it's silly to make them take Algebra 1 again. Or here are some additional summer or after school courses that will allow you to make up credit. You've been doing this extracurricular or job activity, and you can see that you've learned a certain amount of skills from that. What are some ways we can think of how this helps you meet your graduation requirements? So understanding that this does take effort and time and thought from the school, but this type of advocacy for the young person is really what's necessary to ensure that young people make progress in their graduation, and understanding that they still have learned coursework, even if it's sometimes not easily understood from their transcript. And similarly, various pathways to diploma. This can look like states allowing a young person to get a diploma from a different district where they spent a lot of their time because they meet the requirements of that district, or even providing a state diploma as long as they've met certain state graduation requirements to ensure that a young person can get their diploma and can kind of progress in their education. So putting a little bit of time and thought into what a young person has really learned and how this can lead them to graduation, rather than being just focusing without any flexibility on the graduation terms of a certain school. And then finally, we wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about accountability and enforcement measures, because we all know that legislation is only as good as the folks that are implementing it. And we wanted to build in pieces in the legislation that allows for this effective implementation. So some of the issues that go with that are that youth and families have access to their own education information. There's data collection, internal review, and public reporting regarding credit transfer issues, just so we have data on how many young people are getting credit, how many people are graduating. And I think as advocates in this space, we all understand that we hear so many stories of the challenges that young people face, but we don't often have the hard numbers to back that up. And that is really important to make sure that we are addressing solutions effectively. Effective monitoring, including working groups and task forces that can kind of make sure that legislation is being implemented, consequences for lack of compliance, and authorizing court enforcement for legislative reform. So these are all various elements of accountability and helping states implement the recommendations that we put forth. And then Maura will share a little bit about the PA bill on this issue.
Yeah, I just wanted to give an example of state legislation which was sort of in the works and being developed, and what elements were included in that particular legislation that both the Juvenile Law Center and Education Law Center have been working on in Pennsylvania. So here we have Senate Bill 662 and House Bill 1956, both of which were sort of recently introduced in a bipartisan way. Both bills would establish and are similar in certain regards, would establish a new process for students who are impacted by what we're calling educational disruptions, and it specifically includes students who are in the juvenile justice system, in order to try to address the credit transfer issue, as well as ensuring access to a traditional high school diploma. So that particular legislation includes some of the features that have been highlighted in our recommendations with regard to infrastructure, et cetera. So for example, first, it ensures that students receive credits for the coursework that they have completed in placement. Specifically, it requires the state to define what's a partial credit, what's a full credit, how are we going to assess this? Is it based on seat time? Are there multiple ways in order to assess whether the credit should count? So in this particular legislation, we're looking at, is there a test that could be administered? Is there a way to show that they've earned sufficient credits for it to count, and to count towards graduation is critically important. So to ensure that local education agencies are recognizing the credit as counting if it aligns with our particular state standards, for example, and that all of those credits must be counted towards graduation. It also provides access to a state-issued diploma. We borrowed this in part from Maine's legislation, which has been doing this for many, many years, whereby if a local education agency, after applying all of the requirements that are set forth in the law, determines that they will not award a high school diploma from their particular school district based on their requirements and in their particular local jurisdiction, the student would still have access to a state-issued diploma if they meet state standards. So for example, if the child has taken their 4 years of English, 3 years of math, whatever it is, then they would be issued a diploma to ensure that they're not shut out. It also includes important reentry support for students so that those credits are being assessed. There is a coordinator and a point of contact that is responsible at the local education agency for ensuring that credits are assessed and that they are really drilling down to ensure that they're accounting towards graduation, but also reentry support to ensure that they're in the proper school placement and that they're promptly re-enrolled in school and not diverted to alternative education for disruptive youth or other inappropriate placements, and that they are doing graduation planning for that particular student at that local level. And there has to be, as part of this, important coordination with the juvenile justice placement, and it imposes certain requirements on the juvenile justice placement as well to ensure that those records and those credits are transferred. And I'll turn it over.
To build on what Maura said, we are really interested in making progress on this area throughout the country. And so our hope is that this report will be able to be used by advocates and policymakers to explain the need for and give examples of how to make legislative change in your state. And so if you, like us in Pennsylvania, for example, are trying to push for legislation around this issue or want more information, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We hope the report will be useful for you, but we have our contact information here. Our emails are really the best way to get in touch with us in this time that we're still working remotely. And we can provide, help you drill down on what the examples are from other states and provide other technical assistance. So don't hesitate to reach out. I want to highlight that on the website that's linked at the bottom there, we have, in addition to the report itself, also fact sheets that can be, are more digestible to hand over to a policymaker to explain this issue. We'll also soon have up an explanatory video, and we, would love for all of you to also be sharing these through your social media networks. But we wanted to make some materials that even if you never talk to us again, you could just download from the website and take on a legislative visit and hopefully help make the case for why this change is urgently needed. I also wanted to shout out an additional resource that the organizations represented here, as well as our partners at the American Bar Association Center on Children and the Law, have put together a blueprint for change, education success for young people in the juvenile justice system, that has 10 goals around what young people need to succeed with their education while they're involved in the system, with benchmarks and then examples of resources, policies, and practices for each of those. Goal 9 is around transitions from into and out of juvenile justice facilities. And so in addition to this report, there are a lot of other resources there that can really support not just educational reentry, but also that initial transition with education for the young person coming into the system and into detention or another type of correctional facility. So that website I'll put in the chat. It's jjeducationblueprint.org, and just want to direct you there as one more additional item that the organizations here have worked on. And I think we have answered all of the outstanding questions that were in the chat box through writing, but we can stay on just a little bit longer in case anyone else wants to write in a question that we can answer live or in writing. There have been a few questions about what information will be available to you. And so we will be able to send out the PowerPoint and the links to the report itself in a follow-up email. This webinar has also been recorded and we will post it. Thank you all so much for joining. We know there is a lot going on in the world, and we appreciate all the work that you do with and for young people.
And a special thank you really to all of our panelists today and everyone from our organizations who have helped put together this report. It really took a lot of minds and a lot of expertise. And so we're really grateful to everyone for all of their work. And we hope that it is a valuable tool for your advocacy as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that. I encourage everyone to use the report with legislators. I know that in Pennsylvania, we sent our report to legislators, and that prompted some response and action to try to move legislation along. So I just wanted to highlight that. There's also as was mentioned, a fact sheet that may be more helpful and more targeted to provide to legislators. So we encourage you to use the tools and resources. Thank you.
Well, we will end today, but thank you all so much for participating in our webinar and for your thoughtful questions. As we've mentioned, we are available to continue this discussion, and we look forward to talking to you soon.